I had been working as a shift manager at a small town Pizza Hut for about a year, and it had its ups and downs like any job. But one night in 2020 took a terrifying turn I'll never forget, and I still feel uneasy thinking about it. I was 21 years old at the time, feeling confident with my position and used to handling the usual work chaos. But I could have never prepared for what went down that night. To understand what happened, you should know a bit about the person who caused it all. He was someone I'd known since I was a kid. Let's call him Derek. Derek always seemed off. Even as kids, while everyone else was just running around or playing soccer, Derek would be getting into trouble stealing from local stores, picking fights, and breaking things just because he could. He was the type of kid parents warned you about, telling you to keep your distance. As the years went by, Derek grew into that same kind of adult. I would hear stories about him around town, about bar fights, vandalism, or small run-ins with the law. Nothing major, but just enough to keep people uneasy. Most of us who grew up around him could tell there was something dark brewing beneath the surface, and we tried to avoid him whenever possible. The night it happened started like any other Tuesday shift. I'd been managing the closing shift at Pizza Hut for several months by then, and I was used to the quiet, almost surreal calm that settled over the restaurant at night. In a small town like ours, late-night customers were rare, and on weeknights, the place felt practically deserted by closing time. I was always prepared to lock up alone, keeping an eye on the time as the last stragglers left. On this particular night, though, the quiet was almost oppressive, as if the silence itself had weight. My team and I barely spoke. The kitchen sounds sizzling oil. The clink of dishes felt louder than usual. Even the refrigerator hummed louder, filling the empty space with an odd electric tension. The air was heavy, thick, and there was a feeling I couldn't shake, like something was lurking just outside the edges of my vision. The clock on the wall read 11:10 p.m., only 20 minutes to go before I could lock the door. I was in the back, going over the nightly checklist and mentally cataloging everything I'd need to finish before we could call it a night. There were still the usual tasks: wiping down the counters, counting the cash drawer, putting away any leftover ingredients for the morning crew. It was mundane work, things I'd done hundreds of times before. But tonight, everything felt somehow more urgent. I was reviewing the supply list and waiting for the minutes to crawl by when, out of nowhere, the front doorbell chimed. The sound was unnaturally loud in the quiet, making me jump. That chime was typically so routine it barely registered in my mind. But on this empty, late-night shift, it pierced the silence like a warning bell. My heart skipped a beat as I looked up and saw him, Derek. He'd walked through the door like he owned the place, swaggering a little too confidently for someone who clearly had no business being there so close to closing. In one hand, he held a bottle of whiskey, half empty, the contents sloshing dangerously as he staggered slightly. He was already halfway through it by the looks of him, his eyes glassy and bloodshot, unfocused, and a little wild. Derek's presence sent a wave of unease through me. I'd known Derek since we were kids. He was infamous around town, a guy who always seemed to be on the edge, never quite fitting in, always pushing boundaries and causing trouble wherever he went. Growing up, I'd heard stories about him getting into fights, stealing from local stores, and, most unsettling of all, going on these late-night, half-drunk wanderings around town that sometimes turned violent. But seeing him there, in the restaurant I managed, was different. It was too close for comfort, especially with so few of us there. The small staff that night consisted of myself, Tim, my coworker, and an old classmate of Derek's, and Sarah, a part-timer who was still relatively new to the job. Tim had known Derek back in high school, though I doubt they'd exchanged more than a few words since then. We exchanged a worried glance as Derek stumbled toward the counter, muttering to himself and laughing at some private joke only he could hear. Tim leaned toward me and whispered, "Maybe he'll just grab a pizza and go." I nodded, hoping he was right. But in my gut, I knew this wouldn't be so easy. Derek wasn't here to just grab a bite. His gaze was too sharp, too calculating, like he was looking for something or someone specific. And soon enough, he spotted Tim. A slow grin spread across Derek's face. He raised the whiskey bottle, toasting in Tim's direction. "Timmy," he slurred, his voice too loud for the quiet restaurant. "Long time no see. Remember me?" He laughed, but it was a harsh, grating sound, like nails scraping against glass. I could feel the tension radiating from Tim, and even though he tried to stay calm, I could see his jaw tighten as Derek approached. "Hey, Derek," Tim replied, keeping his voice neutral, trying to keep the peace. "What brings you here so late?" Derek shrugged, swaying a little, his grin turning lopsided. "Oh, just looking for a good time." He laughed again, but there was something off about it. His eyes held an edge, a darkness I hadn't seen before, even in the worst of his teenage mischief. Derek leaned over the counter, his breath reeking of whiskey, and fixed his gaze on me, as if suddenly noticing I was there. "And who's this? The big boss around here?" His tone was mocking, laced with a hint of menace. I felt my heart quicken, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Hey, Derek," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's almost closing time. Maybe you can come back during regular hours?" I hoped he'd take the hint, but deep down, I knew he wouldn't. Derek straightened up and let out a mocking, exaggerated sigh. Come on. Just a little pizza, right? What's the harm?" He glanced at Tim and laughed, as if we were all in on some joke only he understood. Ignoring him wasn't an option anymore. He had a look in his eye that I'd seen before in the roadier customers who came in late, the ones who were looking for trouble, who enjoyed pushing people's buttons just to see what would happen. But Derek was different. He wasn't just looking to stir things up. There was something darker there, something dangerous lurking just beneath the surface. Tim shifted uncomfortably, glancing at me for direction, and I could tell he was feeling the same unease. But before I could say anything more, Derek suddenly leaned across the counter and jabbed a finger in Tim's direction. "You remember that time in high school? You and your buddies thought you could mess with me, huh?" His voice was low, almost a growl, and his face twisted in a sneer. Tim looked taken aback. "Derek, that was years ago. We were just kids." Derek didn't seem to hear him. "You thought it was funny, didn't you? Making me the butt of all your jokes, laughing behind my back. Well, guess who's laughing now?" Tim took a step back, clearly uncomfortable, and I could feel the tension rising. Sarah, who had been quietly watching from the corner, looked terrified, her wide eyes darting between me and Derek. I knew I had to defuse the situation before it escalated any further. "Derek," I said, forcing a smile, "why don't you let us get you a pizza to go? On the house. Then you can enjoy it at home, okay?" For a moment, he seemed to consider it. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing as if he were weighing my words, and for a brief, hopeful second, I thought he might take the offer. But then he shook his head and took a swig from the whiskey bottle, laughing bitterly. No, he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I'm not going anywhere." He slammed the bottle down on the counter with a loud thud, the sound echoing through the empty restaurant. I could feel my pulse quicken, my palms starting to sweat. This wasn't going to end well. Derek's gaze shifted from me to Tim, his expression hardening. "You think you can just ignore me? Act like I'm not here?" "I'm done being ignored." He leaned over the counter, his face inches from mine. "You should have never crossed me, Timmy. I don't forget." Tim's face paled, and I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. I wanted to reach out, to pull him back, but I was rooted in place, paralyzed by Derek's intense stare. Derek leaned over the counter and looked right at me. "Hey, haven't seen you since high school," he slurred. His words were thick with alcohol, and his gaze was intense, almost challenging. I forced a polite smile. "Hey, Derek, what can we get for you?" He laughed, ignoring the question, and looked at Tim. "Long time, man. We should hang out." "Hey, let me come back there," he said, staggering forward toward the employees only sign. He pushed the door open and stepped into the back area like he owned the place. "Derek, you can't be back here," I said firmly, stepping in his way. But he ignored me, heading to the cutlery station. I watched in horror as he reached for one of the sharp kitchen knives we use for slicing. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely steady. He grinned, holding the knife up, and made a joke about protecting himself. But something about the way he looked at me, holding that knife, didn't feel like a joke at all. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I was the only manager on duty, and it was up to me to handle this. I glanced at Tim, who looked equally tense, his eyes darting between me and Derek. I stepped forward cautiously. "Derek, you need to leave. This area is for employees only." For a moment, I thought he'd laugh it off and walk away, but he didn't. Instead, he tightened his grip on the knife, his gaze cold and challenging. "What are you gonna do about it?" he sneered. I had no choice. I lunged forward, grabbed his wrist, and forced his arm up, pinning him against the wall. He struggled, trying to shake me off, but I was determined. "Get out of here, Derek," I hissed, forcing the knife from his hand. After a tense struggle, he finally stumbled back, rubbing his wrist and glaring at me with a strange smile. "You'll regret that," he muttered. "I'll be back, and you'd better watch yourself." Then he turned and staggered out of the restaurant, leaving me shaken and uneasy. Tim and I stood there, stunned, listening as the bell chimed again, signaling his exit. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me, but the relief was short-lived. Something told me this wasn't over. The rest of the evening was painfully slow. Only a handful of customers trickled in, and by midnight, most of the other workers had already clocked out. It was just me, Tim, and another coworker, Sarah. I was grateful for the company, but as the minutes ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that Derek was going to come back. The bell above the door echoed again, and I felt a chill. There he was, stumbling back into the store, the same wild look in his eyes. This time, he didn't have the knife he'd left that behind, but he was still unsteady, reeking of alcohol. "Where's my buddy?" he slurred, looking directly at me. "Where's that manager who thinks he's so tough?" My heart sank. He was looking for a fight, and there was no reasoning with him in this state. I took a deep breath and kept my voice calm. "Derek, you need to leave. You can't be here." He staggered closer, his fists clenched. "Or what? What are you gonna do?" he challenged, his voice a harsh whisper. "You think you're safe back here?" Sarah grabbed the phone, dialing 911 as discreetly as she could, while Tim tried to talk Derek down. "Come on, man," Tim said, trying to stay calm. "You don't want to do this. Let's just go get a drink somewhere else." But Derek wasn't listening. He lunged at me, trying to swing a punch, but his movements were sloppy. I managed to dodge and stepped back, but he kept advancing. Tim and Sarah looked terrified, and I knew I had to do something fast. As Derek swung again, I blocked his arm, using his drunken state to my advantage. I twisted his arm behind his back, forcing him down to the floor. He let out a strangled growl, but I held him down, waiting for the police to arrive. I was trembling, my heart pounding, but I couldn't let go. When the police arrived minutes later, they quickly assessed the situation. Derek was still struggling, but they managed to restrain him and escort him out of the store. I finally let out a breath, relief flooding through me as they took him away. In the days following the incident, I was rattled, unable to shake the images of that night from my mind. I'd never considered Pizza Hut, or any place of work for that matter, a place where I would encounter real danger. Yet here I was, struggling to feel safe in the very spot where I spent countless hours every week. My hands would tremble whenever I reached for anything, whether it was a pizza cutter, a plate, or a broom to sweep up at the end of the night. The restaurant, once just a mundane setting in my life, now seemed darker, haunted by the memory of Derek's menacing presence. I tried my best to carry on as if everything was fine. I forced smiles, greeted customers as usual, and tried to keep my focus on the tasks at hand. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that it was over, the fear lingered, stubborn and persistent. Every time I heard that chime from the front door, my heart would leap, and I'd quickly look up, half expecting Derek to stumble back in. Drunk and wild-eyed, his smile twisted with malice. Even when it was just a friendly family or a regular customer, the sound of that chime felt sharper, piercing through my nerves. My coworkers noticed the change in me. Tim, who had been there that night, tried to reassure me. "He's gone now. The police took care of it, remember?" He'd say whenever he saw me jump or glance nervously toward the door. But even Tim's words, meant to comfort, only reminded me of that night. I was grateful for his support, but no amount of reassurance could take away the memory or the fear. The reality was, Derek had always been a shadow over our town, someone people feared but never expected to confront face to face. And now, having been on the receiving end of his rage, I felt like I was carrying a piece of that shadow inside me. The nights were the hardest. I'd lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything that had happened in painstaking detail. What could I have done differently? Should I have called the police sooner? Should I have just let him be when he walked in, hoping he'd leave on his own? All the what-ifs haunted me, twisting my thoughts until I felt trapped in an endless loop of regret and anxiety. Sometimes I'd hear a car pull up outside my apartment, and I'd freeze, half expecting to see Derek's face peering through the window. I told myself it was irrational, he didn't know where I lived, and even if he did, the restraining order should have kept him away. But logic did little to calm the dread that settled in my stomach, tightening its grip with each passing day. Then, exactly a week after the incident, my fears were confirmed. I was working a late shift, counting down the minutes until closing, trying to keep myself busy with tasks to push away the memories. I was up front, tidying the counter, when that all-too-familiar chime echoed through the restaurant. My body froze, my heart pounding as I looked up. There, standing in the doorway, was Derek. This time, he looked different. He was sober, his face calm, almost composed. But somehow, that only made him seem more menacing. I felt a chill run down my spine as his eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, piercing. He ignored the restraining order, as if it were just a trivial detail, something that applied to everyone else but not to him. He walked up to the counter, a smug expression on his face, and leaned forward slightly, closing the space between us. I couldn't look away, feeling trapped by his gaze. My hands clenched the edge of the counter, my knuckles white with tension. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and eerily calm. "Can I get a glass of water?" The request was so simple, almost absurd, but it was laced with an unspoken threat. He didn't care about the water. He was here to remind me, to let me know that he was still around, still watching, and that no restraining order could keep him away if he decided otherwise. My heart pounded as I turned, slowly reaching for a glass, filling it with water, feeling his gaze burning into the back of my head the entire time. When I handed him the glass, his fingers brushed against mine, sending a cold shiver up my arm. I wanted to pull away, to retreat, but I forced myself to stand there, to keep my expression neutral. He held the glass in his hand, watching me intently as he took a slow, deliberate sip, his lips curling into a smirk. It was a look of triumph, a silent message that he wasn't going anywhere. He was playing a game, and I was his chosen opponent. After what felt like an eternity, he set the empty glass down, nodded at me, and turned to leave, disappearing into the night as if nothing had happened. I let out a shaky breath, my whole body trembling as the adrenaline surged and then faded, leaving me feeling drained and empty. I knew then that he wasn't going to just vanish from my life. Derek was the type of person who thrived on fear, on control, and he'd found a way to get under my skin in a way that felt almost irreversible. Since that night, I haven't seen him, but I know deep down that he's still out there, lurking in the shadows, biding his time. Part of me wants to believe that he's moved on, found someone else to torment. But another part, the part that keeps me awake at night, knows that he could come back at any moment, with that same smirk, those same eyes that see right through me. Working at Pizza Hut has never been the same. I can't walk in without feeling a knot of tension in my chest, and every time that bell chimes, I feel the same jolt of panic, wondering if this is the time he's come back. I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the room for any sign of him, unable to relax. The restaurant, once a place where I could lose myself in the familiar routine, has become a place of dread, tainted by his presence. I wish I could say I'm over it, that I've moved on. But the truth is, Derek left a mark on me that night, a scar that isn't visible but runs deep. I've tried to explain it to my friends, to my family, but they don't quite understand. They say things like, "Just don't let him get to you," or "He's probably forgotten all about it," but they didn't see the look in his eyes, didn't feel the weight of his presence pressing down on them, didn't hear the threat hidden in his voice. They don't know what it's like to live with the constant fear that he could show up at any time, that he could be lurking just around the corner, waiting. The irony isn't lost on me. It was supposed to be just another jobs, a way to pay the bills and build some experience. But now, every shift feels like a test of endurance, a struggle to keep my fear at bay, to hold on to a sense of control that feels increasingly fragile. Some days, I think about quitting, about finding a new job where I can start fresh. But I know that, no matter where I go, the fear will follow me. Derek has found a way to become a part of my life, a shadow that lingers, unseen but always present. And so, I keep going, trying to find some semblance of normalcy, trying to convince myself that he's just a man, just a bully who feeds on fear. But in the quiet moments, when the restaurant is empty and the only sound is the soft hum of the kitchen, I can't shake the feeling that he's still there, watching, waiting,